Welcome back to another iteration of MGTOW Talks. I'm here with our friend Coltaine, whom you all know by now. He was just regaling me with a tale of how he used to wrestle and slay drop bears back in the day. But today, speaking of drop bears, we're talking about evolution and how it's taught, its implications, and how it's widely misunderstood, misapplied, and generally ignored. So, with that said, I'll let Coltaine begin.
Yeah, well, I guess this topic sort of came up as a general discussion we had about the way a lot of people don't really seem to understand how evolution actually works. I think most people these days generally accept evolution as the dominant theory behind the science of biology, but even people that accept it don't really fully understand how it works and the implications of it.
Yeah, that's a fundamental problem. It's difficult to accept something if you don't understand it. There are, of course, exceptions. There are some very obscure theories of physics that, according to people that I don't understand, are probably true. But something as easily understood as evolution by natural selection should be understood, ideally, and it's not. And I think we can agree that rather than outright deny its validity, it tends to be people on the left who, particularly those involved in social media, who display an astounding ignorance with regards to it.
Mm. Well, I think specifically with the left, it comes down to the nature versus nurture debate, and for the left in particular, a lot of things about evolution contradict their political philosophy. They they want a version. I think one of the issues is they want a version of evolution that accommodates their political ideals of everyone's equal and tabula rasa, basically the blank slate.
That's true, and that was particularly true of the late Stephen Jay Gould.
Mm.
His theory of spandrels is in part correct, but he actually tended to over apply it, and he was an avowed Marxist. And that's not to say, let's not commit a genetic fallacy here, but he did often apply his political ideology to the science he was trying to do,
Yeah,
and that was ultimately a mistake on his part.
yeah. He's actually an interesting one because on the one hand, he actually did do some very interesting work in the field of evolutionary biology, but I have several friends who are cognitive psychologists, and the books that Stephen Jay Gould put out, like The Mismeasure of Man in response to the bell curve, he is pretty, his stuff in Evo Bio is great, but most psychologists consider Stephen Jay Gould to be a laughing stock.
Right, and this is what I mean. There are a couple of issues at stake here. One, he overstepped his boundaries. He was a paleontologist, actually, by trade.
Yeah.
And like I said, the theory of spandrels is considered valid. It has to be very specific, but it is considered valid. But because he was politically motivated, he entered into realms that he had perhaps should not have entered into. But
Mm.
I specifically, and we can talk about this later, I was talking about the sort of the very waffly, ethereal, effete leftist leaning social media, such as Young Turks, who
Mm.
just have no knowledge whatsoever of this stuff. I mean, it's anecdotal, but I've seen many such examples. They were offering some stupid report about some divers off the coast of someplace, and it was they came very close to being sort of bumped into by some large baleen whale. I think it was a humpback, and I think it was Anna Kasparian or one of the moderators saying something to the effect of, I would be terrified of being eaten by the whale. And this was not said in a joking manner. We're talking about a baleen whale here. Now, I
Yeah.
suppose some sort of accident. It just seems highly. It's so unlikely that would ever happen, and certainly not by design. No baleen whale would consume a man by design.
Mm. It's
The,
pretty hard to mistake a person for plankton.
yeah, yeah, I think so, and it's just one of many examples of the kinds of things I hear from the political left or people just aligned with it. Not of course including people such as Thunderfoot. Obviously, they understand, but
Mm.
they say, "Oh yeah, they'll make fun of people who aren't down with evolution or quote unquote don't believe in it, whatever that means." But
Yeah.
they can offer very little insight as to what evolution is by natural selection. They don't understand the process. They don't. You brought this up before. They don't understand things like cladistics, and they don't really
Yeah.
care. And it's and so in a sense, evolution has been part of sort of almost a doctrinal a set of doctrines that the left has adapted and adopted as well without actually understanding what its implications are. And this, of course, does dovetail with what you were just talking about. I mean, there are implications, potential implications to the theory of evolution by natural selection. And if you don't understand what the theory is, one, you don't have to accept the implications, and two, you're not going to understand the implications.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think a lot of the incorrect things said by people like the Young Turks, people on the left, I think they ultimately stem from the same misunderstandings that the people, I don't want to say the right, but your Christian or Muslim creationist type people, that the idea. Um, I'm sure you've heard the argument. If we all done evolved from monkeys, how come monkeys are still around now? And yeah, I find it, a fairly ignorant view of evolution. But I really do think that a lot of people that accept evolution as the dominant scientific theory, they kind of they don't outright say that, but they have a similar view. Like even if you look at the famous picture that best represents evolution, which is the descent of man, you start with a monkey-looking animal, often depicted as a modern chimpanzee, that begins to stand upright and ends up with the Homo sapien holding the spear. I think there's a lot of people that accept evolution that still have this idea that it's a linear process. They don't understand cladistics and taxonomy and phylogeny. That that linear image of the descent of man is actually somewhat what's the word?
Misleading.
Yeah, it's actually somewhat misleading, because if you actually look at the skulls for those different hominids, there is actually it's actually like a branching type tree. It's not a clean linear progression from one species to the next.
Well, this is, I think, clearly a legacy of the past. I mean, when Darwinian theory of natural selection became widely accepted as accurate and true, people set out to find the quote unquote missing link, and various hominid relatives and
Mm,
ancestors were misassigned this position.
yeah,
Earliest on, Neanderthal, which of course is probably our closest cousin, a northern, essentially a northern European ape that went extinct sometime in the last 20,000 years or thereabouts. They thought, oh, this has got to be it. But then they realized, no, the skull encasing the brain indicates the brain would have been too big, blah, blah, blah. Later on, I forgot the guy's name. There was a prominent Dutch explorer, or maybe a paleontologist, and he discovered the remains of what turned out to be Homo erectus, approximately 800,000 years old. And well, this has got to be it. But then still, brain was too big, and so on. And just of course, in modern paleontology and biology, scientists accept that there everything is a missing link in some sense.
Yeah.
But there is
I
no
mean,
one, this is it. Uh,
yeah. Well, that's another one of the things. I suppose it's not even just the way that evolution is taught; it's also the way that it's reported on in the media. I suspect it's because a lot of quote science journalists, they have journalism degrees, but a lot of them don't really understand the details of what they're having to report on from week to week, and as a result, almost every time some new fossil is discovered, the title is always, "Is this the missing link? Is this the fossil that proves Darwin's theory?" And I'm like, I facepalm every time I see it because
hominids,
the
hominid, sorry, but
Hmm?
hominids are quite tricky. I mean, that the problem with hominids with us is that we're tricky. We're all very similar to each other. I mean, we're remarkably similar even to orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. There are such things that are much closer to what would call, let's say, a missing link in. I don't want to go off topic, but this is related. In the case of cetaceans, that is, whales and dolphins. And
Yeah,
there have been since the 1970s many quote unquote missing links discovered, and one, for example, crucial piece in the puzzle was the positioning of the ear bone and its relation to this allowed experts, not myself, mind you, to detect whether or not this transitional form could actually drink salt water and not be poisoned by it, essentially. And that was sort of a missing link moment. But in the case of hominids, the similarities are just overwhelming, and so it's really difficult.
yeah. What I meant more was sort of what you were saying before, where whenever fossils are discovered, it's always reported on as being, a discovery of some missing link. But I think that it shows a misunderstanding of biology in the sense that people, if you want to reduce things right down, people are walking, talking chemical reactions, and you are the result of a 4.5 billion year long unbroken chain of chemical reactions. And if you go back through each generation, every generation you don't have is a missing link. It's just the idea to me of trying to like the more information we have, the better. But I don't know that there are any gaps large enough left in the theory that we can say this fossil is a
Yeah, I
missing
mean,
link.
at best, for example, I could imagine the importance of finding the immediate ancestor of, say, the common chimpanzee and Homo sapiens. I mean, Homo
Mm,
sapiens and chimpanzee, they are the closest living relatives of each other. And then, of course, gorillas branched off further, still back in the past, and then orangutans. And that, I mean,
yeah,
that could be interesting, but still, as far as a missing link, and for that matter, what is finding the skeletal remains or fossilized remains of the primate ancestor of all modern apes, and then you go still further back, and the monkey, and I mean, so yeah, but it's
well, I mean, this is what I meant. Where I think one of the fundamental problems is that it's not taught in such a way. Most people that even accept evolution don't understand cladistics, where it's not a linear progression; it's a branching tree. And every generation where a an organism reproduces, say, a chimpanzee has three offspring, those three offspring are now three new branches on the tree. We obviously have to simplify it and group them into species, but yeah, in the broader sense, every generation is a missing link. I think, yeah, I just think the a lot of people that talk about missing links, they don't do it for the sake of simplifying the tree. They do it because of a fundamental misunderstanding of the process.
okay. So we should talk a little bit about cladistics for the audience because maybe some people aren't familiar with. So cladistics is a way of classifying species, and it can get very confusing even if you're familiar with it. and essentially based on the LCA, the last common ancestor, and you have a bunch of organisms that are put together based on whether or not they have shared characteristics from that last common ancestor. And there are different, we talked about this the other day, different ways of going about it. You have
Mm,
monophily, paraphily, polyphily, etc. And it can get pretty confusing. But
mm.
a basic understanding of why cladistics are used and is, I think, pretty important to understanding the theory of evolution.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, and it makes sense once you get your head around it, where you have animals, and then within that you have vertebrates, and then within that you have fish are vertebrates, and you know you've got reptiles and mammals. They're all vertebrates, but they've branched in different ways. And then within reptiles, for example, birds are technically classed as reptiles because they came from that branch after the split with mammals. But then you get into polyphily, where mammals and birds are both warm-blooded. That's like a trait that they have independently.
Convergent evolution.
Yeah, they've converged on like warm-blooded, but that that change happened after they split from an earlier branch.
Right.
So we would classify them as a polyphyla, where they share a trait, and you could group them together as both being
And
warm-blooded, but they're not actually, they didn't inherit that trait
and
from a common
that's
ancestor.
exactly, and that's the important difference in taxon. So taxon is just another way of saying clade. So in the case of say birds or lorises and tarsiers, they both display these groups. They display qualities or characteristics that were common with other species, but weren't actually directly inherited from a common ancestor, the last common, the LCA. In the case of monophily, you can see you can see in the chart here, the diagram, you can see that in the case of monophily, all of these particular species, apes, humans, new old world monkeys, have inherited certain traits, let's just say opposable thumbs in this case, and this goes back to the common ancestor.
Yeah.
So things of that nature are not well understood, but a lot of it has to do with education. I'm older than some, many perhaps. I didn't learn a lick of evolutionary theory in high school, though my recollection of high school is pretty dim
Yeah.
and incomplete. Most of what I learned came afterward. I think, to be honest, my awakening to knowledge in general didn't happen till after high school. In
Mm.
so many respects, in most respects, this could be a testament to the abysmal state of the American education system, or something else entirely. I don't really know. But yeah, I'm curious. How, is evolution taught in? Okay, you're not quite as ancient as I am, but were you actually taught evolution in high school?
Yeah, I mean, we had mandatory science classes, and part of those mandatory science classes was biology. We were taught that evolution was the dominant theory, but I guess I'm the same as you. I didn't really fully understand evolution until several years after high school. I remember my aha moment of evolution. I was actually reading Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel,
Yeah.
and he was talking. He was talking in the book about the domestication of corn as a useful grain crop, because what used to happen, or I suppose there are still natural strands of corn that exist, but it was the cobs were much smaller, and what would happen was the corn would dry out, and then the pod would pop open and spray the seeds out. If you found a corn plant that didn't do this, that stayed intact, and then you re-sowed the seeds from that plant, you could propagate that that genetic trait within like you could basically direct the crop that you wanted to grow, and that was sort of when yeah, I mean, I basically understood. Okay, domestication makes sense. You know, you encourage the traits that you want to propagate. Obviously, if there are things like situations in nature that encourage certain traits and discourage others, it's exactly the same thing. It's just unguided, I guess. But
Well, no,
I
no,
think,
not unguided. It's guided by seeking genetic fitness. I mean, there are obviously
yeah,
telltale signs, but it's not a
I meant guided as in a conscious effort on the part of
right, right.
like
Absolutely.
there's no God overseeing these things. It can just it's naturally emergent. It's not being intentionally directed.
Except by Zeus, of course.
Well, yeah, but I think one of the issues is the it's I don't even know that it's necessarily that the education. I think, you know, there obviously I think things could be done better. Things can always be done better, but I don't know whether it's that the education system is shoddy or whether it's just the fact that if you try to, you know, force information on people through a curriculum, they're not going to absorb it as much as if they actually take an interest in it and study it on their own. I mean, we were taught physics, we were taught biology, but it wasn't really until several years after high school that I started reading, you know, Origin of Species or A Brief History of Time. I think, yeah, it's possibly down to the fact that people learn better when they seek the information themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was, ironically enough, when it came to language, a late bloomer. I couldn't stand studying foreign language in high school. And my first foreign language was actually, well, more or less, was Latin. And I did it on my own. I began teaching myself, and just because I was interested in classical antiquity and what have you.
Yeah.
None of that came from high school the American scholastic tradition. But I think there are ways of making it perhaps relevant. I mean, to understand evolution is to understand ourselves. Much talk in MGTOW circles, much of what we talk about, although it's not explicitly named or mentioned, are simply much of it is simply a description of what human beings are, how they interact with each other, and certainly to budding teenagers who are in the throes of hormonal rage, I mean, they're not really thinking rationally, mind you, but it certainly could help understand some of these processes, and for that matter, adults as well. I think it's so important that people understand evolutionary theory, particularly for that reason, because if in understanding that, they can better understand themselves. It is the basis, the groundwork for all things related in human sciences. You don't have a human science without evolutionary theory by natural selection. It's just
No.
no, it doesn't work.
I think if I was to offer a change to the education system, particularly in the field of science, I think the bigger problem is the idea of trying to teach critical thinking through rote learning. And I think even with better fact based teaching of evolution, you could still potentially run into problems later on where people take the facts that they've been taught but misapply them without critically thinking. I think one of the most annoying things I've seen over the last few years is the emergence of epigenetics and the way people misapply that. Again, particularly with your progressive left blank slate types, they've kind of glommed onto this idea of epigenetics because they don't fully understand it, and as a result, they think that it's reignited the nature versus nurture debate to the extent where some of the things I've heard people people try to justify under the guise of epigenetics is basically on par with Lamarckian evolution,
Well,
which
right. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he was a 18th century naturalist. You couldn't really call him anything else because back then, and basically he had some insights into how into selection pressures of how animals evolve, but a lot later on his theories weren't accepted, and but there because the the changes that he offered proposed were due to circumstantial events were just too short term to it was thought to have an effect on organisms, and
I, I,
with
I think the best way to describe it would be Darwinian evolution is intergenerational evolution, whereas Lamarckian is intragenerational.
yeah, right,
So with
and
Lamarck, the changes happen like an individual organism could change itself within its
right.
lifetime, and as a result, a lot of people don't know this, but you know, communism, particularly in the Soviet Russia, they people like to talk about social Darwinism and blame Darwinism for the massacres of the last century, but the dominant theory, like Stalin, for example, was a big fan of Lamarck. Like that was the communists really rather preferred the Lamarckian branch of evolution than Darwinian.
Well, that's a really good, actually, very good description. The difference between say intergenerational versus intra generational. But most of the things that I see proposed by the kinds of people you're mentioning, epigenetics wise, they're really just unremarkable. I mean, the famous example is the Dutch famine that took place during the Nazi occupation of Holland, and how mothers who didn't have access to food gave birth to a generation that was much more susceptible to obesity, blah, blah, blah. So
Mm.
it's kind of, but as you pointed out, I believe, how is this all that different in reality to, mothers who consume crack cocaine or drink
Yeah,
copious amounts of
drinking while
alcohol?
smoking while pregnant. But I mean, this is the problem: is that people have heard the term epigenetics and they think it works similar in a similar manner to the way Darwinian evolution works, but they don't understand it doesn't work on the basis of selection pressures. It's really more it's really more happening at the biochemical level, where if you're exposing the fetus in its developmental stages to alcohol and stuff, it's going to the way those genes express are basically going to malfunction. And on top of that, there's quite a lot of argument as to what degree epigenetics are heritable. There is evidence that certain histones and things like that are do can be inherited, but it's not at a noticeable level above gene inheritance. But yeah, the problem is that people have taken this new science of epigenetics and basically taken it well beyond the scope of what it actually covers, and they're basically claiming that, you know, intelligence is a good example where they were basically, I've seen people say, up until recently, it was thought that intelligence was highly genetics based, but now with epigenetics, there is a case to be made for changes that can be made within a person's lifetime. Like if you read a lot of books, you'll have smarter offspring, and that's just not the case. That's not how epigenetics works.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's important when we look at the etymological roots. Epi, the Greek preposition in this case, meaning upon. So it is something layered upon something else. In this
Mm,
case, the epigenetic phenomena are layered upon the actual genetic phenomena,
yeah.
and it seems not too dissimilar to the way some people twist and just frankly speaking fantasize about quantum mechanics. You mentioned this film. What is it? What the bleep are you talking about?
Yeah, what the bleep do we know?
Yeah,
It's a uh, it's ostensibly a documentary that it's a lot of the philosophies in it are your sort of Deepak Chopra type stuff, where you can change reality by thinking about things.
Yeah, yeah. Not none of which is actually supported by actual physicists
No, well,
who.
the interesting thing about that movie is they interviewed a bunch of physicists and then selectively edited their interviews to try and make it look like they supported it. Yeah, it's really rather rather the worst kind of documentary, to be honest.
Yeah, but I think it, as much as damaging as that is, it's not as, I suppose, heartfelt as things related to evolution, and so
No,
epigenetics seems to be this way out of effectively what is a genetic straitjacket. I mean, nobody denies that if you deprive a human organism of certain nutritional standards, that
mm,
organism probably won't grow to be as tall as it otherwise would be, or as intelligent, etc. But on on the scale of what that maximum potential is, that is already predetermined by genetics. So, I mean, it's possible that instead of being 174 centimeters, if I had perfected my nutrition in childhood, maybe I would have grown to be 177. Who knows? But there was no way I was ever going to be, say, 196 centimeters because that just wasn't in the genetic cards for me.
yeah,
And this can be applied really across the board to things that seem abstract, but ultimately are the products of neurology, such as intelligence.
yeah. Well, I mean, and that's again like epigenetics. People don't like people have heard this term and think it's like genetics and there's selection pressures and stuff. And but what's actually happening is it works on chemicals attaching to the DNA sequence, and basically when the the DNA double helix is unwrapped and rewrapped and reproduced, these chemicals that attach to certain parts of the DNA sequence restrict certain genes from being expressed. So again, like it's very much a modifier to the genes rather than something all to itself.
Yeah, yeah, and I think one thing that just, and this is just an ongoing discussion, if you will, that people like the idea of being sort of independent agents, and they like the thought of being able to mold themselves to their heart's content with no limitations whatsoever. And it seems sometimes this is the case. I mean, I've mentioned this before. Someone who spends the first 20 years of his life without any natural talent for it, however, say doing hill sprints and sprinting, he's going to be pretty good at it and certainly better than the average person. But he wouldn't reach his real talent lies elsewhere. And so, of course, you can train these things and you can improve on them, but
Yeah.
certain things are just not in the cards, and
Well, I
people.
think you mentioned it before. I mean, I'm kind of not the most fit person. I'm not like super overweight or anything like that, but I don't really go to the gym. I don't do a lot of exercise. If I did start doing that, I could greatly improve my cardiovascular health, my strength. I could run faster and further than what I can now. Like these things can be improved, but no amount of training is ever going to allow me to run like Usain Bolt because
Yeah,
I don't have the ACTN3 gene. I don't
yeah,
I'm not
everyone
as I'm
needs
not
it.
as I'm not as genetically suited for those kind of you know high speed sprints that he can do. Same thing like Eastern Europeans. I wouldn't be able to lift like I could bulk up and I could drink protein powder, but I'm never going to be able to compete with some of the Eastern Europeans in weightlifting.
Well, I think it's interesting. if anyone who's lifted weights for a while, and I'm someone who has no talent for this. That is, I'm not genetically gifted.
Mm.
It's if you know anything about genetics and how genetics express themselves, that is has always been one of the clearest indicators to me of how you can just see it. People's different body shapes, the way they deal with nutrient absorption. I mean, bodies are not identical on an individual level, and you can see, some people can take in tons of carbs and they don't seem to put this away as adipose tissue, that is fat, and just the way people react to resistance training, their length of their muscle bellies, the size, and so on. I have absolutely zero talent for things athletics related. I don't have an athletic bone in my body, and very early on, years ago, I just saw how I was working very, very hard, and whatever his name is next to me is just hitting the weights much less frequently, not paying attention to his nutritional needs, and he's 3 times as big as I am, has less body fat, etc. And
Mm.
you just see instantly now. It's from that you can also see how that might apply to other things that might be more abstract, such as intelligence, musical ability. It's true that we don't have there's no visual cue that we can say, well, this is it. But clearly, some people have a better ability at some things than other things. It's just in the gym, it's really apparent.
Yeah.
And this is even true for the people who don't know with regards to steroids. Now, I have tried steroids in the past, never a lot, but I noticed I didn't have a tremendous reaction to them. Whereas there's other people. I mean, I don't. This is actually related. Look at some of the top competing Olympic athletes. That is, Mr. Olympia. Not only are they genetically gifted in terms of muscle mass and muscle shape for the most part, they have two other gifts. One, their steroid receptors are amazing. They're able to actually utilize the steroids, the drugs that they're taking, to maximize the results. And the other beneficial thing is they're one of the few people who can engage in these excessive doses. Not everyone, but many of them, without suffering potentially lethal health consequences. I mean, so that itself is a form of genetic expression that not everyone has. Most people, if
Yeah.
they were taking megagrams of various compounds, would have serious health related issues because of that. These guys don't. They're really lucky. So please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's I've always found that interesting as well, from the standpoint that the general understanding of things like addiction has changed over the last few years, where originally there's a correlation between parents smoking or being alcoholics and their kids smoking and being alcoholics, and it was originally thought, and I guess if you just looked at that data, you could argue that there was a causal link that if you are a parent that drinks, your kids are going to drink too. But the current theories are that if you the a kid, when they start smoking or drinking, years 12 to 16, say, the most influential people in their lives are actually their peers. It's their peers
Absolutely.
that give them a cigarette. What actually causes them to become alcoholics is a predisposition to an addiction to that chemical compound. They it's not that they saw their parents smoking and decided to smoke themselves. It's that their parents and themselves share a genetic predisposition to that addictive substance.
Absolutely. Peer groups. I mean, this has been well studied, and this is actually part of the three laws of behavioral genetics that I've talked about quite a number of times. Peer groups are the most important, and it does seem. And one thing that I find very interesting is this has been briefly talked about Pinker. The data are definitely out there that, for example, children of single mother homes tend to do less well than the two parent homes. And in particular, daughters who are of single mother bent seem to replicate the process. Now, oftentimes, this has been attributed to a lack of a father, but I have looked recently some research that suggests that genetics might have an influence on this. That is to say that what we're seeing as a causal factor is not so much a lack of father in the household, so much as the daughter is inheriting the same kinds of genetic cues that the mother is inherited, and is reactive to the environment of reproduction in the same way.
Yeah.
So I think we there definitely is an overemphasis on how much influence a parent has, and most of the data and research I've seen is pointed to, once you reach the early teenage years, I mean, there isn't a whole lot of influence going on.
No.
Even, and this is particularly, I'm going to be making a video of this, assuming I survive my trip to Italy and come back, about language acquisition. We do not, certainly the words that we are exposed to first are usually the words of our progenitors, but the way language changes, the way it becomes current, and as it's acquired at the very end years of the critical period, that's primarily due to peer influence. I do not speak the English of my parents. I mean, and it's were I to have children, which is very unlikely. It's unlikely they would have speak the English I am speaking, etc. So
Mm. Well, I mean, we've all got friends who are, I mean, for instance, have several friends that are first generation Australians, and some of their parents don't even speak English at all. Like I've got one friend whose parents are Shanghainese, and they cannot speak English. I've got another friend who's Macedonian. Parents can't speak English, but yeah, they have perfect Australian accents. Clearly, the culture that they live in, their friends, their peer groups, what they see on television has a greater effect than their parents in that sense.
absolutely, and that's why this has been tested out many times in language acquisition research. So Pinker points this out, and I believe the Blank Slate has an entire chapter on this. But the the reality is that parental influence is fairly minimal, barring some extreme. Obviously, beating a child routinely is going to have some serious,
Yeah.
will have lasting effects potentially on a child. Depriving of food and nutrition. I'm assuming all things going reasonably well on that front. Peer influence is far more important and critical. The most important
Yeah.
thing that parents do is they feed and clothe the child and allow it to survive in order to make copies of its own genes. It's not to give it a particular input. That's not to say you can't learn something from parents, but we almost on an instinctual level, we naturally are inclined to ascribe greater importance to peer groups, and there's a good reason for that, because the peer groups are the groups that we are going to live in and consequently coexist with. It's not the previous generation that we have to compete with, reproduce with, etc. And so there's sound reasoning behind our natural inclinations to be influenced to a greater extent by peer groups, and to pay more attention to what peer groups have to say.
Mm.
So that it makes absolute sense in the context of evolution as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, once you leave the nest, I mean, I live about 2,500 kilometers away from my parents, so that's a rather expensive plane flight for me to go back. I don't deal with them on a daily basis.
Yeah. Speak of the
But
devil, I mean, I'm visiting my parents in Italy. I see my parents once a year if I'm lucky, and I went maybe almost 5 years once without seeing them. I've lived in Europe and Asia my entire adult life, and they still live in the United States. So,
yeah,
but I think this also illustrates, by the way, that the classic concerns that parents have. Why why are my kids smoking and drinking and doing drugs? I told them not to. And the whole idea of parents not being cool. I mean, cool in this context is really just a synonym for peer acceptance. I mean, teenagers are
Social relevance.
social relevance. Yeah, I mean, teenagers care about what people think because they're becoming reproductively active. They're sort of sussing out the environment, and
Mm.
of course they're going to pay more attention to that because that's the environment they're developing into, and they have to coexist with and compete with, and with competitors. And
Well, I
parents
guess
are irrelevant in that
this
regard.
this is, I guess, somewhat of a microcosm of what I spoke about in my last video, where what it is they're reacting to the environment that they have to survive in, and their parents outside clothing and food and shelter up until the ages of sort of 18, 20 years old. Outside of that, the parents aren't really relevant to your survival.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And by the way, those of you who have not watched this video, I believe it's called Biological Dualism, yes? Please
Mm.
check it out. I'll be posting a link in the low bar. Coltaine put out another fine video for your viewing pleasure, and it's quite well done. Very nice graphics in it as well, so check that out. Yeah, absolutely. It ultimately comes down to relevance, and I think this there's been just a tremendous overemphasis in contrast to what the actual science tells us on
Mm.
parenting. Uh,
Yeah. I
and
think I think if anything, the most damning evidence of all has been the twin studies and the adoption studies.
well, speak of the
Um,
devil. I know you haven't watched it yet, but Barbarossa's latest video does talk about twin studies with respects to voting tendencies and how there's
yeah.
a genetic component to that. But please continue.
Well, I was just going to point out that yeah, that like things like IQ are incredible. It's one of those things where people have always had it in their head that intelligence is something that can be fostered and improved by, reading books to your kids and encouraging them to study better. But all the actual evidence that's been collected over the last few decades with regards to adoption studies has shown that things like IQ and even basic like disposition of personality are highly heritable traits. An adopted child has almost zero correlation with their adoptive parents and almost a perfect correlation with their biological parents. As you said, obviously, if you have an environment which is high in abuse, for example, I mean, that kind of environment is going to be, developmentally damaging to anyone. But in 98% of households, yeah, adopted kids share almost zero correlation with their behavioral traits with their adoptive parents.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out this is also something that's routinely misunderstood what heritability means in a scientific context. Heritability is the proportion of differences that are observed in a trait amongst individuals in a population that are due to genetic differences, and basically measuring how many of those contributions are genetic versus non-genetic, as far as what's called phenotypic variation in a certain population. It's very specific, and yeah, I've seen those twin studies, and they are certainly not pointing to some sort of nurturing of intelligence. Of course, intelligence can be nurtured. My father is kind of a funny guy. I think anyone who's come to know in Stardust, I'm a very intellectually curious person. I don't think I'm exceptionally smart, but I think I'm exceptionally intellectually curious. And my father always said, "Well, it must be because I was reading all those books to you when you were young. That must be the reason." Probably
Yeah,
not, because
yeah. Well, again, I guess it's one of those things going back to the heritable addiction. Without the modern cross cultural, cross generational studies on twins and adoption and stuff, I can see how it would be easy to mistakenly come to that conclusion. But the problem is the science has moved on, but people still want to hold on to that nurture ideal.
Well, yeah, and I think it's important now to mention that this what's framed as a debate is not actually a debate. The nature nurture debate, if it ever had been, and I suppose it was at some point in time, uh, this has effectively been solved in the human sciences. I mean, the debate. A lot of the debate had to do with a guy named B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist, American-born psychologist, behaviorist, philosopher, if you will, and he had all these ideas of behaviorism is now a defunct philosophy or defunct perspective on human behavior, whereby everything is determined by the environment. You can condition things out of people, condition things into people. This is called operant conditioning. This was the term that he used, and unfortunately, all the evidence as it stacked up in particularly the mid 20th century, and then later on in the 60s and 70s, just sort of really just made the whole idea of behaviorism be thrown out the window. Even Skinner even applied this to language, and this is very important. I mean, language. I'll just say it now, and I'll make an entire video on this. Language is not a learnt behavior. Language is quite akin to something like bipedalism. It's innate to us. It is an instinct, and therefore it arose due to selection pressures, and that being selected for as well. But this debate that seems to be a debate in non-scientific circles, and I consider myself a non-scientist, is not a valid one. There's no nature versus nurture.
It's
Everyone,
kind of like the creationists with their whole push to, teach the controversy. And you're like, well,
yeah,
in the field of science, there is no controversy. Sorry, but, the scientific consensus is that, the
yeah,
biological evolution by means of natural selection is how it happened.
yeah,
There's
and
there's no there's no debate. There's no
it's such a pity you
controversy.
didn't watch Barbarossa's latest video. I'm sure you'll still do
I'm
so.
planning to. I'll
Right, because
watch
he
it tonight
talks
after.
about what I agree with. I agree with him on this. That even though I dropped out of the whole atheist movement eons ago, there
Mm,
has been a victory. I think that the ridicule is an important tool when you're dealing with absurdity, and the way the atheist community certainly ridiculed the extreme positions of certain Christians and just creationism in general. It basically
yeah.
put nobody takes that stuff seriously anymore. So it was a victory, but we're now faced with a much more subtle dilemma, if you will, and sort of the resurrection of a kind of faux behaviorism. Nobody, and they're not talking about operant conditioning like they used to in the '60s and the '50s, but the there's this mindset that some sort of there's a contrast, there's a 50-50 contributing factor, that is, you have nature on the one hand and nurture, and one can outweigh the other. That's just not the case. Every piece of science I look at points to what seems to be the fact that you have the nature, what we inherit, and you have the environment that operates upon the epi, upon that nature. But as far as the that operation is concerned, you're just going to get different variations and outcomes, and many times, predictably, as you pointed out in your video, you'll get near identical outcomes, despite differences, in air quotes here, in culture. The the
Yeah.
the Cartesian dilemma, if you will, Descartes' dilemma. This has been solved for quite some time, and solving it actually involved related to linguistics. I mean, the idea that we have a language instinct is, for example, key to this. Uh, Most modern human science, the sociobiology, linguistic theory, cognitive psychology, so much of this is just based on what this mountain of evidence we have that we are not dualistic beings, that the brain is a solid organ, and basically everything we do can ultimately not only derive from but be described in context of its biological relevance to us.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose that it all goes back to what you and the High Lord of biochemistry spoke about, where it's, you know, it seems to make sense to divide the mind from the body, but then, the mind is what the brain does. It's a biological process, and again, like there's other divisions you can make. Like you can try and divide the human from like the gut bacteria, but at the same time, they have an interdependent relationship on each other. The human can't survive without the gut bacteria. And that's my whole problem with this thing of trying to divide the person from the environment that they exist in, is that to me it's a holistic biological ecosystem. And yeah, I mean, as those ecosystems homogenize, we see the same, innate behavior starting to be expressed.
Yeah, and I think the problem, for example, I like to keep the definition simple when it comes to dinocentrism. I just go back. I don't try to make it overly complicated. I think it can be defined simply as the result of female reproductive physiology being a limited factor in reproduction, thus
Hmm.
allowing women to survive to make more copies of their genes. And all the data point to this. I think it's usually somewhere around 40% of 40 versus 80%. That is roughly half of females in history and prehistory reproduced as opposed to males. And it's that simple. And you can, from that simple definition, that is limiting factor in reproduction leading to women being able to make more copies of their genes, you can get all sorts of behavioral variants. You can get medieval chivalry. You can get chivalric behavior in modern American society. You can get all kinds of things. But ultimately, it's derived from that, and making some sort of artificial cutoff, saying, well, that's biological, but here this is just social, is absurd, because all of this is based on this very simple equation of, here you have female human reproductive physiology and all the factors that go into it, having to lug around a kid in your body for 9 months, being very limited in mobility after that, being vulnerable, etc., etc. All these lead to human beings in general, and specifically men, being willing to pay greater heed to their needs, at least for the purposes of reproduction, if only for that reason.
Mm.
And one thing, I mean, Turd-Flinging Monkey brought this up in this whole scarcity idea, is that he ignores all the men that were cut down and died, the non-limiting factor in
Mm.
reproduction, who didn't survive to make copies of their genes. So creating an
Well,
artificial cutoff, it just doesn't make any sense to me, and we should try to keep our definitions pretty simple. And for me, gynocentrism and all of its derivative related behaviors goes back to this limiting factor in reproduction. That's how we instinctually operate.
yeah, well, I mean, in Turd Flinging Monkey's recent video where he spoke about scarcity, I don't know, I just, it confuses me that he can recognize that in a 50-50 population of men and women, men are seen as less valuable, and that if we want men to be seen as valuable as women, we need to create male scarcity. But then he doesn't want to admit that shows an innate biological, gynocentrism.
Yeah.
I think it comes from this. His definition of gynocentrism, I think, is a bit of an exercise in sophistry. He wants to reduce it down to the definition of concern for women, but not then add the thing that it's that concern for women over the concerns of men. Like it's kind of his definition almost ignores the centric suffix on the end of it,
Yeah, yeah, and I think
which
that's goes back to my definition, right? You
yeah,
have a male sex and a female sex in human beings and Homo sapiens. We have different reproductive physiology needs, and basically every trait that we have is a result of millennia, tens of millennia of selection pressures put on each specific sex, leading to different behavioral outcomes, physiology, sexual dimorphism, etc. And of course, the fact that, let's face it, women women can't run around and get lots of men pregnant. They're limited for 9 months, very limited mobility, and they have all these other burdens put on them afterwards immediately. And even in the very simplified equation of, men are simply cut down in times of war and the women are taken away to be, raped or just kept as sex concubines or reproductive concubines, they're still making copies of their genes, and the men who are dead are not.
Yeah.
So you
Well,
need to
like I
have
said,
the
I
man
mean,
in the equation in this to understand what gynocentrism is.
yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, I think the problem is I'm pretty sure I'm sure he'll comment in the comment section, but I doubt Turd Flinging Monkey would disagree with that what you've just said. I mean, I think the problem is that he doesn't want to define gynocentrism in that way.
Well, yeah, and I
He's making a linguistic argument rather than one. Like, I don't think he's arguing the facts of reality, but he just doesn't want to call that gynocentrism. I mean, to me, I guess, if you want to have a linguistic debate, yeah, I just don't see that that definition
well,
is
it makes
particularly useful for the discussions that we're having. It doesn't
he and I
offer
believe
any. Mm,
your fellow Aussian Peter Wright, he's a big proponent of some sort of social conditioning thing. Peter
mm.
Wright. They just use
Is,
dictionary.
is he Australian? Is he?
He's an Aussian, yes.
Yeah.
And they both make use of the dictionary definition. But we've seen that, the dictionary definition of feminism, I think was Girl Writes What rather funnily put it, she's a dictionary definition feminist, right? I mean, right?
Yeah.
It's dictionary definitions can be useful, but they can also be misleading,
Well,
and we should try.
beyond that, I think they can be misapplied as well. Like, Peter Wright, I got into it with him once where he was trying to say that the terms MGTOW and MRA were basically interchangeable, synonymous terms. This was around about the time that Woolly Bumblebee was, having her meltdown, and there was kind of a split starting to happen between MGTOW, the YouTube MGTOW community, and AVFM. And yeah, I got into it with him on a comment section, and he was basically arguing that the terms were interchangeable because a MGTOW has to advocate for themselves inside their own head, therefore they're a men's rights activist or advocate. Which, I mean, he had to rely on some 1850s edition of Merriam-Webster to make that argument. Every other dictionary disagreed with him, and on top of that, I would say that rights are not a thing that exist inside a person's head. Rights exist, are agreed terms between a group of people, so you can't advocate for them explicitly inside your head without any external action. But yeah, it's that you can take what are otherwise relevant dictionary terms and then misapply them, I think.
Yeah, and in the case of gynocentrism, any dictionary definition you find is not going to have what I believe the requisite additional mention of how we can even get a gynocentric system to begin with. And for that, you need to look at evolution and the different selection pressures put on human males and human females. And so it's much better to approach these things from a point of understanding, specifically scientific understanding, rather than just going to a dictionary and saying, well, this is how it's defined. You can look at a dictionary and say language learning, and okay, it says in the dictionary that we learn languages, but that's just not sufficient to say that we learn languages. There's more on this later. I am preparing a video slowly but surely for after Italy, if I'm still alive,
Yeah.
going very
Well,
extensively in this. But
yeah, well, I think the thing to hammer home about that is what you said before, where we learn language in the same manner that we learn how to walk on
yeah,
two legs. Like, it's
Well, colloquially,
I
people
don't.
talk about that. Hey, Jimmy learned to walk when he was blah blah blah, and then he learned this. I mean, we use this term, but it's not
Mm,
actually descriptive of the processes
no.
involved whatsoever. I mean, I will talk more extensively about this, but for those of you who think that we learn languages, I challenge any of you to try to have some sort of recollection, whatever your native language might be. In the case of English speakers, of at what point in time you quote unquote learned to apply the present perfect progressive. And those of you who aren't familiar with grammatical terminology, you might not even know it. But if you're a native speaker of English, I can guarantee you that you're using the present perfect progressive correctly. And this is because it was an integrated system, part of an integrated system, a wider system. It's an algorithm, in fact, that you integrated into your brain when you were a child, because children are language sponges. We have a language instinct. For that matter, speakers with gendered languages, I assure you, you did not sit down and memorize this is the gender of this word or that word. This happens. You don't have a recollection of it because you absorbed it. Because just as you don't have a recollection of your bipedalism, you don't recall. I stood up upon the glories of Mount Everest. No, you crawled and then you began standing up and you began walking. And as a final note on this, like I said, I'm preparing an entire video on this subject. You have to think about the complexity of syntactic systems, and for that matter, phonological. That's a somewhat separate topic of natural language. Syntax in natural language is simple and elegant, yet incredibly complex. They're just not, for it to be a learnt activity would not actually explain what's going on at the level of the brain because of its complexity. There has to be an algorithm. You can call it a learning algorithm if you want, but there has to be an algorithm in place that is hardwired to comprehend and absorb syntactic patterns and then produce structures that we call sentences in order to do so. And I've talked about this in the past in terms of I think it was in escape velocity. I talked about this. So you need to have this ability as a human being to do this, because if you can't, then you're not going to be acquiring a language, and this is why you don't have a a a recollection of these things. And I don't want to talk too much more about that. But do you have anything else to say about this?
Not really. I mean, language isn't really. I know a little bit about it, but it's not really my area of expertise.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, recursion, as I talked about before, the very property of recursion is basically a hard evidence against any sort of conscious learning that goes on, because what you're getting is an absorption of we call what is called a parameter in syntactic theory, a parameter of a specific language, and you absorb that parameter via your language algorithm, and from this you have recursive production. A 10-year-old native English speaking child can produce an infinite number of grammatical sentences with all sorts of really complex structures, such as the present perfect progressive, pluperfects, etc., without really any thought, and this goes ad infinitum. The fact that you have an infinite recursive possibility for production is proof in the pudding that this is just not a learned behavior. Now we spent so much time talking about language, maybe we should get back on track.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything else, or
Well, I think we've covered most of the basics. Evolution, epigenetics. The parental influence, nurture versus nature. Those are the big ones. But yeah, I guess it comes down to the fact that yeah, even people that accept evolution and the scientific consensus on things like epigenetics, for example. I mean, it is a thing. It is a field of science. It's we can observe it. It's predictable. It's repeatable. The problem is that when people when people accept it but they don't fully understand it, they kind of they misapply it in a way to try and support their own specific um, political or ideological reasons, I think.
Well, this seems to me, on a final note, the next great challenge, if you will. So there was a great challenge in the atheist movement, which I suppose the neo-atheist movement, that sort of had its prime in the early and mid 2000s, and then just sort of trailed off. And I would highly recommend you watch Barbarossa's video because he talks about this to some extent. I think the next great folk revolution, if you will, I'll call it a folk revolution, is the the induction indeed the introduction of a new perspective on human beings and how human beings operate and how they work, based not on sort of folk wisdom or what we are sort of naturally inclined to, but really reflective of what the scientists tell us. This could be, I think, an even greater step forward than, say, having evolutionary theory taught in school or what have you. The implications are, of course, far greater as well. But I think this is the next great battle that we face, and this is a intellectual battle that I think is just far vaster than the one before, because you're gonna meet. This is going to be met with resistance on all sort of sides of the political spectrum, the left, the right, because the issues, and hint hint, I do plan on making a video if I'm alive after Italy, talking about specifically this topic and how this is sort of such a risque topic, but driving this home, I think, is a much bigger project. And frankly speaking, we don't have anyone out there trying to do so. The closest well-known person, I think, that even attempts at things like this is Girl Writes What. She's fairly well known. She talks about sex differences. She talks about the evolution and the history that went into it and what have you. But people ignore it. I see all the time. People don't actually pay attention to those aspects, and they just kind of focus on feminism or this or that. Thunderfoot, for example, gives a free pass in his interviews with Anna Kasparian, who is a blithering idiot, really, and makes no attempt to remedy her ignorance. It's it's a far greater battle, and unlike the victories of atheism, and I think Barbarossa is right in saying that there was a necessity and a need for it in its time, I don't see any corresponding movement popping up. I mean, I'd like to think I'm trying, at least in the MGTOW sector, trying to propose a different approach that's more aligned with the modern science to understanding human beings. And certainly Barbarossa has attempted that. But this is the next great battle, I think, the battlefront that is slowly forming. We don't actually see sort of camps, as it were, but it's gonna be met with even more resistance because the consequences are far more profound, I think, if
I don't
accepted.
I don't even know if it's just a problem of consequences. I mean, with the case of atheism versus Christianity versus Buddhism, whatever, all of those things kind of exist inside the ideological spectrum. You can. I don't think. I guess there have been arguments made that there is a biological predisposition towards religious belief. I tend to think. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the rates of atheism are pretty high. I mean, and whether you accept Christianity or Islam, or whether you look at the science and see that those are faulty claims and reject that ideology, I think the difference is that this issue goes deeper than ideology, where you look at the female in-group preference and the male out-group preference. I mean, these biological realities literally go against our innate predispositions. I don't. Yeah, I think in the case of
Right.
religion, it almost exists entirely in the realm of ideas. But yeah, this would require And I think that's one of the biggest problems with Gamergate is that Anita Sarkeesian is a hack fraud con artist, and you can argue against it as much as you like, but the problem is it doesn't matter what facts you present. It doesn't matter that you can show that she stole other people's let's plays and that you know Zoe Quinn was sleeping with journalists that gave her work favorable reviews. It doesn't matter that you can show nepotism and fraud because all people hear is woman being attacked.
Right, and I think this is the major point that. All right, sorry, please, I interrupted. I apologize.
No, I was just saying that you can point if you point out the fact that like if you pointed out that there was some Christian minister that was embezzling a whole bunch of money, people wouldn't have too much of a problem with indicting that guy or investigating him. But yeah, it's just in this case you can clearly show these things are happening, but our innate we have innate biological proclivities that are hindering the rational process in this case.
Yeah, well, it's what feels right is actually incorrect. That's the biggest obstacle, and I've even seen. I'm gonna need to read up on this more. That some scientists have proposed a kind of an instinct towards dualism. That is, we're sort of hardwired to perceive the world in a dualistic fashion. You know, you have the abstract, the mind, and the body, and they're somehow separate. None of the science
Yeah.
tells us this. The science tells us the opposite. But and so,
This is like I think did you do a video on what did you call it, innate science or something?
it's yeah. Well, innate. There's innate physics. That most
Yeah.
commonly. This is, I mean, specifically, this is referred to as sort of human physics or innate physics. That
I think it was it Einstein that said if the theory of relativity doesn't match up with our common sense, it's not that the theory of relativity is wrong; it's that our common sense doesn't
Yeah,
adequately
but
match reality.
even when I think when scientists refer to sort of innate physics, they're talking about some basic ideas behind Newtonian laws of motion that don't match up with how we actually perceive the world via our optical system and our brains. And it seems to me, at least, and I'm just haphazarding a guess, that the way we evolve, for better or worse, kind of we sort of just ended up in this situation naturally, and because the world seems this way, and for example, we seem to say, "I raise my right hand," and it's you doing it, even though you know MRI scans will show you that there's something else going on, and that before you even made the decision, we could see what's going on in your brain, and blah blah blah, and
6 seconds earlier. There's an excellent BBC Horizon documentary starring or made by Marcus de Sartoy, where he does basically that experiment, and they could tell which choice he was going to make a full 6 seconds before his conscious brain settled on it.
yeah, things of that nature. It just goes against the way we perceive the world, and without scientific tools and media, as in means of, there's no other way to go about things. We only have that which we are and that which we have as human beings to avail ourselves of. But once you add all these external tools, things like magnetic resonance imaging and testable theories of, say, the laws of motion and all of this other stuff, it all falls apart, and it's something that will take a very, very, very long time to settle in. And this is, of course, related to, say, free will, which is, once again, in scientific circles, this is not a debate. There are different branches of people who acknowledge there's no free will, but nobody says has this sort of conventional notion of free will that a lot of people do have. And
Mm.
even if you watch the talk with High Lord Biochemist, I mean, his presentation of free will didn't match up whatsoever with what most people term free will. He talks about an
Yeah.
integrated system, and that self and free will, if we're going to even call it that, is an emergent property, etc. So this battlefront, and it encompasses so much. We've been spending over an hour talking about it. It's massive, and I don't know if it's ever going to get out to the public, but I do think it's important. If we want to live in a world that actually makes real progress, we're
Yeah.
going to have to represent that world in an accurate manner, an accurate fashion that actually matches up with what we've learned through the sciences. We can
Yeah.
know we're at a position now that we can no longer rely on simply instincts and how we naturally perceive the world, because we know now that half the time they're incorrect and they're not feeding us the right information.
Yeah. Well, it's that, like as our understanding of the world increases, our perception of the world has to change to match that new understanding.
Absolutely. By the way, it's intuitive. The term specifically was intuitive physics. Didn't come to me. Yes, intuitive
Intuitive
physics.
physics.
That's the
Yeah.
term that is commonly used. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we should ideally, but how it's just as you pointed out, they're very much apples and oranges. I mean, it's easy to point out the ludicrous nature of religion. It doesn't seem ludicrous to think that what I see, what I perceive, what I think, it actually matches up with how reality is. But oftentimes it is ludicrous when you look at the evidence and what the scientists are doing to uncover some of this stuff.
Yeah.
And never mind people's lack of interest. I mean, it's even the whole atheist thing was
Mm.
of limited scope. Not everyone was involved, let alone something of this magnitude. Forget about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is one of those things though where it's not just interest. I mean, the idea when you start getting down to the concepts of free will and what is the self. I mean, they're terrifying concepts, and I remember hearing quite a few debates within the atheist community about free will. And I mean, I know a number of atheists myself who they are atheists, but they still believe in some nebulous concept of the soul.
Mm.
They are willing to admit that some man in the sky that watches over them is a silly idea, but they can't let go of that concept of they're they're that they're some type of special snowflake that is in control of their own cognitive function. And yeah, I mean it just seems to be one of those things that people are. I guess I would describe it as being, in the same sense as being intuitive physics. I would say that, yeah, that idea of Cartesian dualism and the soul and all of those ideas of free will, there just seems to be like an intuitive idea of psychology or biology which doesn't necessarily match up with the scientific reality that we objectively observe.
Now and I think we could actually postulate a reason for this, even if it's not by design. I mean, it seems to me, as far as survival and reproduction is concerned, it's useful to have an ego, an
Mm.
independent ego. It's useful to propagate this idea in your own head, at least. It gives you drive, ambition, all these things, for example, that a male would require
Mm.
for
Reproductive success
reproduction,
and survival.
exactly. As in the females, as far as the female's concerned, concerned with their own safety. There's some sort of you have a nebulous eye, something happening to me, blah blah blah. It's not too dissimilar. All these
Mm.
things seem to make sense, and I wish people. It'd be interesting if people could actually do studies on this from this perspective, and I think there have been. I need to read up on them, but in that context, it does make sense. It's useful for making copies of your genes, but that doesn't mean it's an accurate representation of what's actually in front of us and what's going on in reality. And to
Mm.
me, I think if I were to make some sort of statement, I'd say that this is the most important intellectual battle of our times. I realized I was talking about the other day how I'm intellectually curious, and my curiosity is essentially it's just spanned the human sciences. I've moved from history to language to biology to evolutionary psychology, and I constantly move between those domains. And I just think because of it, it's such an important thing that we understand that we get to this point where we can actually talk about these things honestly in a public sphere without being met with intellectually dishonest and sometimes not even intentionally. It's sometimes just intellectually dishonest by default distractions that, in the same sense that you said teach teach the debate, teach the controversy as a faux way of framing what as if there were a debate in evolution.
Mm.
At least as far as creationists and people, intelligent design people put it. But this is going to, as I've said many times now, repeating myself, this is going to be much, much more challenging and perhaps impractical. I think at the end of the day, there are plenty of people who just want to live their lives and don't really care about what seems to be such an obscure, abstract thing. The same people that I used to call sort of default atheists, they don't worship any god, they don't go to church, but they don't get involved in any of it. They go about their lives as if there is no god or there are no gods, but they don't
Mm.
get involved.
They don't they don't necessarily have an understanding of the theological arguments and the science and why there's no good reason to believe a god.
Right. And Pierre just, I mean, these sorts of things, there are plenty of pragmatic people and say free will, shmee will, whatever, who the fuck cares? And I
Mm.
think the majority of people would fall into that category. You don't
Mm.
need to understand any of this to have a quote unquote good life. But
Mm.
if if we're talking about human progress on the whole, real progress, that is progress that doesn't obscure and fall into obscurantism, then I think it is essential, at least that some people bother with some of the details.
Mm.
And MGTOW going your own way can definitely be a gateway towards this. Certainly, the awakening of certain things not adding up to the narrative we're told in society with respects to men and women uh, eventually potentially leads to a vast expansion of that, and you eventually can arrive at a much greater picture of what's going on. And I think in that sense, we are going our own way. I personally feel motivated to do what I'm doing because of that awakening that I had. But it's that initial awakening isn't enough for me, and we need to just take things to the limit as much as possible.
Mm.
All right, I think. Do you have anything else to say, Lord Coltaine, or are you gonna go back to swatting cane toads?
Well, no cane toads in the climate I live in, but no, I think we've pretty much covered everything we needed to cover. So, yeah,
Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up here, and I hope you enjoyed that. As I said, I will be away for a week or more, and hopefully I'll return intact and everything. And I do have a lot of things planned, long scripted videos, that kind of thing, that I've been meaning to get done. And yeah, so alluded to some of it. We'll see. As always, thanks for watching, and may your chosen deity watch over you. Bye bye.
catch you later.